Hello, dear friends. My name is Zaporizhzhia. I'm a Ukrainian journalist, and I invite all of you to watch this latest update on Ukrainian battle map situation as of October the 22nd. So don't forget to like this video, subscribe to this YouTube channel, and leave your comments below. Today, I'll be talking about Ukrainian deep strikes, which have been made yesterday. So it was, I hope, it was really good and massive deep strikes, which made Ukrainian air forces and Ukrainian other forces, landed forces as well. So I'll be talking right now about them and also about the current situation on the battlefield, on the Ukrainian land. So please stay with us. Let's begin today's overview. And don't forget, as I said, to like it, share it, subscribe, and leave your comments below. So what happened over the past day? First of all, there was an attack which the defense forces carried out in the Bryansk region, near Bryansk. There is a facility there that's quite close to the line of contact, because in fact our state border of Ukraine is essentially the line of contact. And here there's a settlement called Siltsi, or rather in Russian, Siltse or Siltso, where the Bryansk chemical plant is located. Yesterday, Russians were closely watching as it was attacked. Here are some images of the missiles. According to Russian reports, there were many different missiles, possibly even the most massive attack that the defense forces have ever carried out on the territory of the Russian Federation, which took place yesterday. This was actually in the evening on October 21st, yesterday, Tuesday. Pekto missile drones, and Storm Shadow missiles were flying there. And as a result, the General Staff reported that through the cooperation of the ground forces, the Navy, and the Air Force, such a strike took place. What does this indicate? It means that airstrikes were indeed carried out by our Air Force. These are Storm Shadow missiles launched from our Su-24 bombers, striking the territory of the Russian Federation. The fact that the Navy participated in this means that Neptune missiles were involved in the attack on the Bryansk region, and the ground forces in general apparently coordinated this operation. Overall, it was reported that our missiles overcame the Russian air defense system and ultimately attacked the Bryansk chemical plant. Russian military bloggers are even writing that the Bryansk chemical plant was simply destroyed, just bombed to the ground. I hope that today we will receive the relevant satellite images that confirm this very fact, that the Bryansk chemical plant has been completely destroyed, because this is quite an important facility for the Russian defense industry, and it is located at a distance that is fairly accessible to us, situated near the line of combat engagement. This plant produces gunpowder, it manufactures explosives and components for rocket fuel, in particular for those munitions and rockets that are used to strike deep into Ukrainian territory. Therefore, the reduction of this capability of the Russian Federation will undoubtedly have an impact on them. And to some extent, this is a demonstration of strength. Because even if, okay, let's say it's not very far from the front line, if we calculate how far exactly the Siltsi site is from the Ukrainian state border, well, let's estimate roughly how many kilometers that is, about 120 kilometers, give or take 120 kilometers. So in reality, that doesn't seem all that far. But on the other hand, in order to achieve a range of 120 kilometers, it was necessary to launch missiles with at least a 200-kilometer range. Those strike assets would have to fly in, pierce through the Russian air defense system, and do so in a section of the front that is clearly one of the most heavily fortified, given that the line of contact is what it is, and then deliver their strikes. Russian war correspondents are actually writing that the Bryansk chemical plant has simply been bombed. I won't show these posts from Russian war correspondents because they contain profanity, and accordingly, YouTube censorship won't allow those expressions used by the Russian war correspondents. So I'll quote almost verbatim. Today, there is a bright star that is close to this one plant in the Bryansk region, in the area where the Sever military group is absent. Of course, we're talking about the Bryansk chemical plant, where something very, very unpleasant is happening. I hope that over the course of today, we will learn more detailed information, see satellite images of what the Bryansk plant looks like, and be able to determine just how much damage our long-range strike capabilities have inflicted on this undoubtedly very important enterprise of the Russian Federation. In addition, yesterday, the Smolensk thermal power plant was also attacked. Part of the city of Smolensk was left without power. These are the kinds of videos showing the strikes on the Smolensk thermal power plant that, by the way, were demonstrated by Russian mass media. Just to give you an idea of where Smolensk is, it's further north than the Bryansk region. Here is the Bryansk region, and here is the Smolensk region. So Smolensk itself is on the border with Belarus, roughly. Well, it's at least almost 300 kilometers from the line of combat contact in Ukraine from the state border. If you go around Belarus, it's definitely about 300 kilometers. If you take this kind of curve, it's 292 kilometers to Smolensk. And that's where our long-range assets struck. Of course, personally, I am not a supporter. I believe these are rather populist statements on the part of our government, and I do not support those media professionals or the president's communications team. If I were in their place and had the opportunity to advise the president, I certainly would not present information the way the head of state does or the way the supreme commander-in-chief does. What do I mean by this? I would not talk about specific numbers. I would not talk about specific actions, such as if the Russians suddenly forget about strikes on our territories or cut off power to this or that city, then we will definitely take symmetrical actions. I would not say that because, to be fair, when the Russians cut off power to Kyiv, let's be honest, we are not in a position, or rather, it's not even that we are not capable, but as of today, it is not our priority to cut off power to Moscow or St. Petersburg. Yes, it is possible to strike Moscow, but that would require far too many resources. These resources can be used much more effectively and efficiently against other Russian military production facilities rather than trying to strike and cut off power to Moscow. In my firm opinion, it is better to strike, for example, at tactical aviation airfields, those airfields from which aircraft take off and launch missiles at our territory, or, for example, at the launch sites of Shaheds. Although, in the end, to be honest, that doesn't really make much sense. It's better to strike at other targets. That is to strike at the production of Shaheds, like in Alabuga, or at the plant near Kupol in Vyzhensk. But the point is, we have many more priority targets at a much closer distance to Ukrainian territory that are better to hit, rather than trying to target Moscow or St. Petersburg and trying to cut off their power. So, if I were the president, for example, I wouldn't make statements that, for example, if the Russians suddenly launch energy strikes against us, we will respond symmetrically. I also wouldn't make specific statements about what we will produce, for example, as he said, 3,000 cruise missiles in 2025. Obviously, we don't have 3,000 of them, and it just sounds like a setup. In the same way, it can sound like a setup, and this will be an argument for critics and the opposition to appeal, for example, against the current Minister of Defense Shmihal, who says that we will produce 20 million drones. Next year, it is actually possible to produce 20 million drones. It's not a problem for the Ukrainian military to manufacture 20 million drones. That's realistic. But here, the real question is different. It's better to show the results, to demonstrate the effectiveness of these millions of drones, rather than just throwing out a banal number. That's much more important. That's why I wouldn't list all these tautological figures. 20 million, 3,000 missiles, symmetrical responses, because it all looks rather populist. And it simply causes irritation among the population, which then reacts quite skeptically and reactively. Sorry for the tautology to such things. So, if I were in the place of the president's or defense minister's communications team, I wouldn't do this. And honestly, I don't understand why they do it. But nevertheless, strikes on the territory of the Russian Federation. We are setting, as practice shows. For example, yesterday Chernihiv was shelled. Chernihiv, in fact, remained without power at least until last night. The energy workers weren't even giving any forecasts as to when power would be restored in Chernihiv. As an eye for Chernihiv, strikes were carried out on Smolensk as well. But again, for example, I personally believe that the eye for an eye system is ineffective, wrong, and not the approach we need. We need to focus, as our capabilities to strike Russian territory grow, on how we conduct these strikes on their territory. Now, let's move on to the course of combat operations. Let's talk about Kupyansk. Ultimately, friends, I've said that, in my view, there is no dissonance given the situation currently unfolding in Kupyansk. Where does the dissonance lie, or where could it lie? The thing is, on the one hand, the president of Ukraine told journalists over the weekend that the situation in Kupyansk is stabilizing. On the other hand, Deep State, and even Deep State, the most trusted source regarding the course of events and frontline circumstances in Ukraine, says that the occupiers within the area are advancing in the Kupyansk area. In my understanding, there is no dissonance at all, because both the president is right and Deep State is right. The president is right, and I know this not only from some open sources, but also from closed ones. Right now, in the sector of Dvorishna, Zapadna, Kindashivka, Radkivka, Holubivka, in this whole sector, the sector that is, let's say, connected with the Oskil River, because for the Russians who are heading to Kupyansk, they first need to cross the Oskil River to carry out this maneuver. Here I have marked the Oskil River in blue, showing how it flows. They need to cross the river either at Dvorishna or at Zapadne, or in the area of Kidrashivka-Holubivka, and in this way they can then proceed further to Kupyansk. So for the Russians, doing this right now is not easy. Their attempts at such actions are being blocked and destroyed by the defense forces. Very, very, very effectively. So overall, these advances in the area that exist, it can't be said that these are some kind of failures or yet another or new failure of our defense. No, this is not a failure of the defense. These are the consequences of that old miscalculation we had connected to the Russians reaching the outskirts of the settlement of Kupyansk, and with their accumulation there in quite significant numbers. The fact that the general staff is changing the boundaries of the enemy's advance here, in reality, to be honest, the front line in this sector is actually, well, really quite conditional. Because even in places where there are red zones, you can sometimes find videos in open source intelligence reports that show geotags, geolocations, indicating the presence of Ukrainian soldiers there. Accordingly, what is the logic of the process currently taking place around Kupyansk? Basically, the function or tasks of our troops are related to cutting off the enemy along the Oskil River. Let me outline its boundaries again. The Oskil River. In order to get to Kupyansk, you need to cross it. Accordingly, the enemy's crossing of the Oskil River is quite a weak component or a weak element of their logistics, essentially their Achilles heel. In the logistics they carry out from Svatove for the entire front. That is why in Dvorishna and in Zapadne and in Kindrashivka, Radkivka and Holubivka, it is possible to destroy the enemy by creating kill zones and preventing them from reaching south to Kupyansk. Essentially, this is the context of stabilization by our troops, what they are doing. On the other hand, by blocking enemy units like this, essentially trapping them as they approach the Kupyansk area, let's say in this zone, it becomes possible to further clear out the city of Kupyansk, dealing with the remaining enemy forces there, those who are still able to advance and cause problems. Because, in a broader sense, unfortunately, it must be stated that we do not have the forces for a large-scale counteroffensive operation. We simply don't have them. So for now, what is happening is an attempt to hold back the enemy, since we are not yet able to cut off their rear lines. But in principle, there is potential. And frankly speaking, from what I hear from the units on the ground, there is a chance to hold Kupyansk as well. And Pokrovsk, because in reality, the situation in Pokrovsk is actually quite similar to what is happening in Kupyansk. The way the scenario of combat operations is unfolding and what the enemy is doing in Pokrovsk in some ways at times closely resembles the overall situation in Kupyansk. The enemy wanted to encircle this city just as they wanted to encircle Kupyansk, but in the end they failed to do so as a result of their unsuccessful attempt to surround the city. The enemy then made a breakthrough toward Dobropilia. This breakthrough cost them quite a high price, because the enemy...
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
Spread out their troops, dispersed their forces that were supposed to be attacking Myrnohrad and Pokrovsk at that time. Instead, they moved toward Dobropilia to relieve and unblock those units that had been sent to... The attack toward Dobropilia is, by the way, primarily aimed at the enemy's current priority target, which is the settlement of Shakla. If Shakla falls, it is highly likely that the enemy will now free up certain resources from the overall Dobropilia direction in order to continue attacking toward Pokrovsk. But as of now, many of the enemy's resources are tied up in fighting on the Dobropilia axis and toward Dobropilia itself, both in the area of Shakov and in the area of Poltavka and Pakovye Yar, right here. That is, on all flanks of this advance or attempted advance by the enemy is being blocked. If, God forbid, they succeed in this sector, it means they will gain additional reserves to attack Pokrovsk. Therefore, this must not be allowed. As of now, with the set of forces the enemy currently has, they are indeed able to carry out attacks on Pokrovsk, on Myrnohrad, and are able to enter the city. But the enemy will not be able to maintain this pace of attacks forever. Therefore, the longer the defense holds in places like Shakov, Myrnohrad, and Pokrovsk, the better it will be for wearing down the enemy. The less resilient the enemy units will become, and as a result, we will have a chance to hold Pokrovsk. We have a chance to hold Kupyansk. We have a chance to hold Pokrovsk. There's really no reason here, as they say, to throw up our hands in despair. But that doesn't... change the fact that the situation is extremely difficult in all these directions, especially since when it comes to reserves, the enemy is trying to create as many hotspots as possible. Right now, I'm not even mentioning the junction of Donetsk, Dnipropetrovsk, and Zaporizhzhia regions. Today, I'll once again highlight the Mala-Tokmachka direction, or rather the Orikhiv direction. So here's Mala-Tokmachka, and here's Orikhiv. This is a more operationally significant area. Well, it's not a strategic direction, but rather an operational tactical one, where the enemy is making attempts to attack from Shcherbaki and Nesteryanka, Kopani, here, Robotin and Novopokrovka. The enemy is now trying to move toward Orikhiv. There aren't that many forces here, although that's a very relative question. What does not many mean? Our units reported the day before yesterday that the enemy, with forces from the 71st Motorized Rifle Regiment, managed to deploy about 26 units, minus 26 pieces of equipment, 26 units of equipment across the completely open steppe terrain of the Zaporizhzhia region. Look at how it played out. In several waves, the Russians tried to advance, but honestly, this is a phenomenon. It's a phenomenon, and it's strange that the Russians continue to bet on mechanized assaults, especially in Zaporizhzhia, where the battlefield isn't just transparent as it has become and is now in Donbass, but in principle, it's wide open in the Zaporizhzhia region. Absolutely transparent, because here, in principle, there are no tree lines like those that exist in Donbass or within the Dnipropetrovsk region or elsewhere, where the enemy logically needs to use mechanized columns. Since now the concept of greenery is disappearing in Zaporizhzhia, it's basically impossible to have any real greenery here. Well, as you can see, it's just step, 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 field, 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 with nothing there, and accordingly, equipment is destroyed very easily. Yes, the enemy used 26 pieces of equipment the day before yesterday in several waves of attacks, each involving 5 to 8 vehicles, most of which were destroyed. Yesterday, similarly, about 12.5 vehicles were used in an attempt to break through to Mala-Tokmachka, but this simply did not yield any results at all. So what is the logic behind these processes taking place in Zaporizhzhia? The enemy is trying to create pressure points for us, because the more pressure points they create, the better it is for them. This is because the more reserves we have to deploy in different directions, the more potential successes the enemy might have in what I believe are the two main directions of attack, Kupyansk and Pokrovsk. In my opinion, these directions remain unchanged. Kupyansk and Pokrovsk are exactly where the enemy will focus the most. As for us, we need to stay vigilant and focused on supporting our defense forces during this undoubtedly difficult period of Russian autumn offensives. So I ask you, please support the defense forces with your donations. And as for my work, please support it with comments, subscriptions, and likes on this particular video. Thank you, friends. Take care of yourselves. All the best. Stay healthy, and see you next time.